The desert training ground stretched endlessly, a barren expanse of sand and rock shimmering under the merciless sun. Heat waves danced above the earth, distorting shapes in the distance, making even the steel target set, a staggering 4,000 meters away, look like a mirage. It stood defiant, a dark silhouette against the haze, daring the soldiers to hit it. The air reeked of gunpowder and sweat. Spent cartridges glistened in the sand, little reminders of failure. One by one, soldiers had stepped up to the firing line, shoulders squared, faces hard, and eyes fixed on the target. One by one, they had missed. The first soldier, a tall, broad-shouldered corporal from Texas, had adjusted his scope with exaggerated confidence. He lay prone, steadying his breath, muttering calculations under his lips. His rifle cracked, echoing across the open desert, but the bullet sailed wide. He cursed under his breath and tried again. Another shot, another miss. The silence after the second failure was heavier than the gun's recoil. Then came the sergeant, a man with 20 years of service and a reputation for sharpshooting. "Watch and learn," he barked at the younger recruits. He dropped to the ground, aimed, and fired. The bullet carved through the air, but found nothing. He clenched his jaw, adjusted for wind, and fired again. Still no metallic clang returned. He fired a third shot, missed. By the fourth, his face was crimson, sweat dripping from his temples. The steel mocked him in silence, refusing to acknowledge his effort. The line moved on. Each soldier tried, each soldier failed. Some cursed loudly, slamming fists against the sand. Others muttered excuses about the wind, the heat, the distance. But none could deny the truth. The target remained untouched. The officer, Captain Harris, stood with arms folded, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. His face, weathered by years of service, bore the stern lines of a man who demanded results. He had expected at least one of his men to land a shot. After all, this was the U.S. Army. These were trained soldiers, many of them decorated marksmen. Yet 12 attempts had yielded 12 misses. He tugged at the brim of his cap and pulled it off, running a hand through damp hair. 12 shots, he muttered, pacing slowly behind the firing line. 12 trained soldiers. And not one hit. His voice wasn't raised, but the weight of disappointment in his tone pressed down harder than a shout. The soldiers avoided his gaze. Boots shuffled in the sand. Rifles were checked and rechecked, anything to avoid standing still under the captain's glare. The desert itself seemed to mock them. The silence was brutal, broken only by the faint whistle of wind and the ticking of a nearby jeep's cooling engine. The heat gnawed at their patience, every missed shot adding fuel to frustration. Private Miller, the youngest of the group, finally broke the silence. "Sir," he said hesitantly, 4,000 meters? That's almost impossible. Even world-class snipers. World-class snipers? Captain Harris snapped, turning sharply. His eyes blazed. "Do you think the enemy cares about your excuses, Private? Do you think they'll call off their fire because the distance is difficult?" His voice grew harsher with every word. "Your job is to do the impossible. If you can't, you're just another man holding a rifle." Miller swallowed hard and lowered his eyes. The captain's words stung, but he wasn't wrong. This exercise wasn't about comfort. It was about proving what could be done under pressure. Another soldier, Specialist Rodriguez, whispered just loud enough for the line to hear. "We'd have a better chance hitting the moon." A few chuckles rippled through the ranks, but they died quickly when Harris turned his gaze on them. "Is this a joke to you?" Harris barked. "Because from where I'm standing, the only joke here is 12 men who couldn't land one shot." The heat pressed down harder, the silence suffocating. Nobody dared speak again. The captain inhaled deeply, then exhaled through clenched teeth. He had to admit even to himself that the distance was extraordinary. 4,000 meters wasn't a shot. It was a miracle. Only a handful of documented hits in military history had reached that range. But that didn't excuse failure. Training was about pushing limits, about forcing the impossible into the realm of possible. He raised his voice again, letting it carry across the desert. So let me ask you this, gentlemen. He paused, scanning their tired faces. Do we have any snipers here? The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and undeniable. At first, nobody moved. Soldiers exchanged glances, some with frustration, others with resignation. The silence stretched, as dry and heavy as the desert air. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, the sound oddly mocking. Harris's jaw tightened. If no one stepped forward now, he would take the rifle himself, just to prove a point. He opened his mouth to demand again, when a soft, unexpected sound cut through the stillness. "I'll try, sir." The voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the desert wind. Heads turned in unison, confusion written across every face. It was her, Private First Class Taylor, the quiet girl. She stood at the back of the formation, her stance straight but unassuming, a wisp of a shadow among giants. Many of the men had forgotten she was even there. She rarely spoke during drills, never boasted, never demanded attention. Now, her voice steady but soft had commanded the entire unit's attention. Captain Harris studied her, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes. Then his expression hardened. "You?" His tone was more skeptical than cruel, but it carried the weight of disbelief. She nodded once, neither flinching nor faltering. Murmurs rippled through the soldiers. "No way. She can't. 4,000 meters?" "She's joking." Doubt filled the air, thick as smoke. But Taylor didn't react. She didn't defend herself. She simply stepped forward, calm and deliberate, her boots crunching softly in the sand. And for the first time all day, Captain Harris felt something stir in the pit of his stomach. Not anger, not frustration, but a faint spark of curiosity. Could she really do it? The desert held its breath, waiting. Captain Harris stood silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the slim figure that had dared to step forward. Dust swirled at his boots as the desert wind carried whispers through the line of men. None of them had expected her voice. Private First Class Taylor, the quiet one. She had blended into the unit like background noise since the day she arrived. She was punctual, disciplined, precise in her work, but never loud, never demanding. When others laughed and shouted in the mess hall, she sat quietly with her tray, eating in silence. When arguments broke out during drills, she listened but never added her voice. The men had dismissed her, some with indifference, others with half-hidden smirks. And now, she had volunteered for the most impossible shot of the day. Captain Harris studied her, his brows furrowed beneath the shadow of his cap. He wasn't a man easily impressed, nor did he grant respect without proof. "Private Taylor," he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Did I hear you correctly?" "Yes, sir." Her reply was calm, steady, without hesitation. The men shifted uneasily. Rodriguez chuckled under his breath, trying to mask it as a cough. Miller, still smarting from the captain's earlier rebuke, whispered to the man beside him, "She won't even reach the target." Their doubts hung thick in the air. Harris's sharp gaze cut through the line. "Quiet," he barked, and the whispers died instantly. His focus returned to Taylor. "You've seen what happened here. 12 men, 12 failures. Each of them trained. Each of them experienced. And you think you can succeed where they did not?" Taylor didn't flinch. "I believe the shot is possible, sir." The confidence in her tone startled even herself, but she held the captain's gaze without faltering. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, born not of ego, but of countless hours spent studying ballistics, wind, and the science of long-range precision. The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. He couldn't decide if she was foolish, brave, or both. But part of him admired the steel in her voice. The desert was full of excuses that morning whined, heat, distance. Not one soldier had spoken with belief. And here was Taylor, soft-spoken, unassuming, yet certain. He gave a short nod, almost imperceptible. Very well. Step forward. She moved past the line of soldiers, each set of eyes following her. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few openly amused. To them, it was almost entertainment now. Let her try, they thought. The target would humble her like it humbled everyone else. Rodriguez leaned toward Miller, muttering, 4,000 meters? She'll be lucky to hit the mountain behind it. Miller smirked, shaking his head. This ought to be good. But Taylor didn't hear, or didn't care. Her boots crunched softly in the sand as she reached the firing line. The rifle lay waiting on the ground, its barrel glinting beneath the harsh sunlight. She knelt beside it, steady, composed, as if she had done this 1,000 times. Captain Harris watched closely, arms folded. He saw no nervous twitch in her fingers, no hesitation in her steps. That surprised him. Many men had trembled under his gaze, even before pulling the trigger. She, on the other hand, carried herself with quiet focus, almost serene. Private Taylor, he said, his tone low but cutting. You understand the weight of what you're about to attempt? Yes, sir. This isn't just about hitting steel. It's about discipline, patience, and control. If you fail, he paused deliberately, letting the silence sink in. You will carry the laughter of this unit with you for the rest of your service? She nodded once, acknowledging the risk, but her face remained calm. Understood, sir. The men exchanged smirks behind her back. To them, failure was inevitable. Taylor settled prone on the ground, her cheek pressed lightly against the rifle's stock. She adjusted the scope, her fingers moving with deliberate precision. The murmurs around her faded as she immersed herself in the rifle's world, the glass, the crosshairs, the distant shimmer of the target. The sun glared down mercilessly, heat radiating from the sand. The mirage distorted the steel plate, making it waver like a phantom. It wasn't just a test of skill. It was a battle against nature itself. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled, centering her breath. Behind her, Harris barked, "Clear the line." The soldiers stepped back, forming a semicircle around the firing point. Their eyes locked on the quiet girl, some with folded arms, others with raised brows. Doubt and curiosity mixed in the air. Rodriguez whispered, "This is a waste of ammo." But even he didn't look away. Taylor's finger hovered above the trigger. She adjusted for wind, noting the slight push of air across her cheek, the subtle sway of dust drifting sideways. She ran quick mental calculations, drop, drift, trajectory. Her mind worked in silence, unseen by those who dismissed her as quiet. Harris's eyes narrowed as he watched her work. Something in her movements struck him controlled, deliberate, exact. Not the fumbling of a novice, not the arrogance of a showman. She was measured, calculating, patient. Finally, she whispered to herself, so softly no one else could hear. 4,000 meters. One chance at a time. She exhaled slowly, her world narrowing to a single steel plate in the distance. But before she squeezed the trigger, Harris's voice cut through. "Private Taylor." She paused, lifting her eye from the scope to glance back. His tone was firm, but quieter now, almost personal. "Understand this. You don't need to prove yourself to me, or to them. You only need to prove yourself to the target. Nothing else matters." Taylor held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. She lowered her cheek to the stock again, and silence enveloped the range. The men leaned forward unconsciously, a desert forgotten, sweat dripping unnoticed down their brows. All that mattered was the rifle in her hands, the distance before her, and whether the impossible could be made real. Captain Harris folded his arms, his expression unreadable. But deep down, a thought stirred within him, one he had not expected. She just might do it. And with that, the quiet girl prepared to pull the trigger. Private First Class Emily Taylor had always been a shadow. In the Army, shadows didn't get noticed. They followed orders, showed up on time, did their work, and slipped away without drawing attention. Most of the men in her unit knew her name only because it was stitched across her uniform. Few remembered hearing her speak more than a handful of words. If the Army was a stage, Taylor was never the one under the spotlight. She was the figure waiting quietly in the wings. But there was more to her story than any of them had ever bothered to ask. She had grown up in a small Midwestern town where cornfields stretched farther than the eye could see. Her father, a retired hunter, had taught her to shoot long before she had learned her multiplication tables. While other kids played video games or joined sports teams, Emily had spent hours lying belly down in the tall grass, a borrowed rifle nestled against her shoulder, her young eyes fixed on distant fence posts or the rusted lids of tin cans. Her father had drilled into her 3 rules: breathe slow, aim small, and never rush. It wasn't about firing quickly. It wasn't about noise. It was about patience, discipline, and learning to see the invisible, the way wind curved a bullet's path, the way heat bent the horizon, the way silence made space for focus. By the time she was 16, she could put a bullet through the stem of an apple from nearly half a mile away. But nobody in her town cared much. She wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of person who boasted. And so, just as she would later in the Army, Emily blended quietly into the background, keeping her skills to herself. When she enlisted, she didn't tell her fellow recruits about her years of practice. She didn't mention the hunting trips where she had waited for hours without moving a muscle, her heartbeat slowing until it felt like part of the earth itself. She didn't brag about her hand, steadying in wind that made grown men shiver. To Emily, silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. But the military wasn't always a place that valued silence. The men in her unit were loud, confident, and competitive. They measured strength by how far someone could run or how much weight they could bench. She didn't fit their image of toughness, so most ignored her. Some dismissed her entirely. "She's too soft," Rodriguez had muttered more than once. "Quiet doesn't win wars," another had joked. "She's just here to make the numbers look good," someone else had whispered. But Taylor didn't respond. She never rose to defend herself. She carried out her duties, trained when asked, and observed everything around her with sharp, watchful eyes. What they mistook for weakness was simply restraint. Now, as she lay prone on the desert sand with a rifle in her hands, those whispers echoed faintly in her memory. She could feel the eyes of every man on her back. They expected her to fail. Some were already preparing their smirks for when the bullet went wide. But she wasn't here to prove them wrong. She was here to prove herself right. Her cheek pressed against the stock. The rifle felt natural in her hands, like an extension of her body. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, adjusting the scope, calculating the wind, estimating the bullet's drop over nearly 2.5 miles. The numbers lined up in her mind, but more than that, there was instinct. A deep, unexplainable intuition, honed by years of quiet practice. She didn't just see the target. She felt it. She imagined the bullet's long arc, the invisible hand of the wind nudging it gently sideways, the way heat shimmer distorted its path. She could almost hear her father's voice, whispering in the back of her mind. "Breathe slow, aim small, never rush." Behind her, the whispers started again. "This is a waste of time. She won't even hit close. She's shaking already. But Captain Harris cut them off with a single glance. His arms remained folded, his jaw clenched. He wanted to believe she could do it, but part of him, the hardened, realistic soldier, told him it was impossible. And yet, watching her calm, methodical preparation, something inside him stirred. She didn't look like the others when they had taken their shots. They had been tense, their jaws tight, their bodies rigid with the need to prove themselves. She, on the other hand, radiated stillness. She looked as though she could lie there for hours without moving a muscle. And in that moment, Harris realized something. She didn't care about the audience behind her. She didn't care about their laughter or their doubts. She was somewhere else entirely, just her, the rifle, and the target. Miller leaned closer to Rodriguez and muttered, "Even if she fires, the bullet'll drop." At 4,000 meters, that thing's practically falling out of the sky. Rodriguez smirked. "Yeah, watch. She'll miss, and Harris will send us back to the barracks." Taylor ignored them. She didn't need their belief. She had her own. Her breathing slowed. Her heart rate steadied. The world narrowed to a single steel plate shimmering in the distance. For her, time seemed to stretch every second longer than the one before. The desert noise dulled, the heat became a background hum, and the men behind her blurred into silence. She thought again of her father, of the endless afternoons lying in tall grass, waiting for the right moment. She remembered the feel of patience, how it sharpened her focus, how it carried her through when others grew restless. That patience was here with her now, wrapping around her like a shield. She knew this wasn't going to be luck. It couldn't be. At this distance, luck was useless. Every calculation had to be right, every muscle under control, every breath measured. She adjusted the scope one last time, her hands steady despite the heat. The target wavered in the haze, but her vision cut through, fixing on it with laser focus. Somewhere behind her, Harris's voice echoed faintly. "Do you know what you're about to attempt, Private Taylor?" "Yes, sir," she murmured, almost inaudibly. "I know." Her finger brushed the trigger, light as a whisper. The men leaned forward, their doubts still alive, but their curiosity now stronger. No one dared look away, because whether she failed or succeeded, they all knew this moment would not be forgotten. The quiet girl had stepped out of the shadows, and the desert held its breath to see what would come next. The rifle lay before her like an old companion, its dark barrel glinting faintly beneath the merciless desert sun. To many of the men who had tried earlier, it had felt like a burden, a weapon too small against the vastness of 4,000 meters. But to Emily Taylor, it was no burden. It was a tool precise, honest, and utterly unforgiving. If you treated it with respect, it answered in kind. If you rushed, it punished without mercy. She slid her body flat against the sand, the warmth seeping through her uniform. Tiny grains scratched against her skin, but she ignored them. Comfort was a luxury she never sought. Her world shrank to the rifle and the shimmering steel plate on the horizon. Emily's fingers danced lightly across the scope adjustments. Click, click. Each tiny turn was measured, deliberate, tested against the wind's subtle caress across her cheek. The desert air seemed still to the untrained eye, but she knew better. She watched how dust devils twisted lazily in the distance, how the mirage shimmer bent slightly to one side, how a thread of wind tugged at the loose fabric of her sleeve. Rodriguez muttered from behind, "She's taking forever." The wind'll change twice before she even fires. A couple of snickers followed, but they died quickly under Captain Harris's glare. Emily didn't hear them. Or perhaps she chose not to. She had long ago learned the value of silence, not just in herself, but in the world around her. The desert, noisy with distractions, demanded discipline. And discipline began with stillness. Her breathing slowed. Inhale, hold, exhale. The rhythm became steady, almost mechanical, but it wasn't forced. It was natural, like the ebb and flow of waves against a shore. Each breath softened her heartbeat, lowering it, calming her muscles until they felt carved from stone. Her eye pressed gently against the scope. The crosshairs danced faintly, swaying with each subtle movement of her chest. At 4,000 meters, even a fraction of an inch here meant dozens of inches there. It wasn't enough to aim. The aim had to become part of her very body. She recalled the nights spent awake in her bunk, studying the physics of ballistics by flashlight, the books she had borrowed, the charts she had memorized. She knew that at this range, the bullet wouldn't travel in a straight line. It would arc, falling back to Earth long before it struck the plate. She pictured the curve in her mind, the invisible path of steel bending under gravity's hand. She pictured the wind as a pair of invisible fingers, nudging that curve slightly off course. Mathematics whispered through her mind. Drop rate, muzzle velocity, air density. But beyond the numbers was intuition, sharpened over years. She didn't just calculate, she felt the bullet's journey. Behind her, the men shifted. Miller whispered, "She looks like she's meditating." "Or asleep," Rodriguez snorted. "Wake her up when she misses." But even their sarcasm was quieter now, uneasy. Something in her stillness unnerved them. It wasn't normal, wasn't the nervous fumbling they expected. It was different. Captain Harris watched with narrowed eyes. He had seen hundreds of soldiers' fire rifles in his career, had studied the habits of professionals and amateurs alike. But what he saw in Taylor was rare and almost frightening patience. She wasn't tense, she wasn't rushed, she wasn't trying to impress. She was simply present, utterly absorbed in the moment. The captain's own thoughts surprised him. She doesn't look like she's about to fail. Emily adjusted once more, tilting the rifle's bipod into the sand for stability. Her hands moved without hesitation, as though every adjustment was inevitable. She shifted her weight slightly, aligning her spine perfectly behind the weapon, her elbows anchoring her body to the earth. Now she was not just lying on the desert floor, she was part of it, rooted like stone. Her thumb brushed the safety. Her finger hovered near the trigger, not pressing yet, not rushing. Timing was everything. The desert seemed to sense it. The wind eased for a moment, the air holding its breath. A crow wheeled high above, silent now. Even the men behind her grew quieter, their sarcasm faltering into reluctant fascination. For Emily, time stretched. Seconds slowed. The heat, the dust, the murmurs behind her, all faded into insignificance. Her world narrowed until it was nothing but her eye, the crosshairs, and the distant shimmer of steel. She whispered to herself, words her father had repeated 1,000 times. Breathe slow. Aim small. Never rush. Her breathing became her metronome, steady and soft. Each inhale lifted the rifle slightly. Each exhale let it settle. She waited until the rhythm aligned perfectly, until the rise and fall of her chest placed the crosshairs exactly where she wanted them. Rodriguez, restless, shifted his stance. "She's not going to shoot." Harris's voice cut him down. "She is." Emily's finger curled ever so slightly against the trigger. "Not yet. Not until the moment felt right." She let her lungs empty halfway, then froze her breath, locking her body in perfect stillness. The steel plate wavered in the heat haze, a ghost against the horizon. She could almost hear it calling, daring her. The distance was absurd, the challenge nearly impossible. But her pulse didn't quicken. Her nerves didn't tremble. She was calm, anchored, steady. In that instant, she ceased to be the quiet girl in the background, the overlooked soldier. In that instant, she became the rifle, the bullet, the calculation, and the silence. Her finger tightened on the trigger, just enough. The desert leaned in closer, listening. And as the mechanism began its inevitable release, Emily Taylor was already imagining the sound she longed to hear, the metallic clang of steel surrendering to precision. The desert was so quiet that even the wind seemed to pause. The air pressed heavy against the soldier's shoulders, dry and suffocating, carrying with it the weight of anticipation. Every man on the line leaned forward unconsciously, their skepticism momentarily forgotten, their eyes glued to the prone figure in the sand. Emily Taylor's cheek rested firmly against the rifle's stock, her breathing slowed to near nothing. The crosshairs danced faintly with the rhythm of her body, but she had trained for this, how to control it, how to move with it instead of against it. Her lungs emptied halfway, locking her into stillness. Her finger tightened. The rifle roared. The sound cracked across the desert like thunder, startling birds from their perches on the ridges. A shockwave rolled over the men standing behind her, pushing grains of sand into their boots. The recoil drove into her shoulder, firm but familiar, as the bullet leapt from the barrel into the invisible expanse of air. For an endless heartbeat, nothing. The bullet sped away, cutting through layers of hot air, carving an arc so long that gravity itself bent it downward. At 4,000 meters, the shot was not a straight line. It was a question flung at the horizon, the answer hidden in silence. The men squinted into the distance. They couldn't see the bullet. No one could. But every single soldier strained to hear what came next. A second stretched into 2, 3, then clang. The sound carried back across the desert, sharp and undeniable, like a church bell in the emptiness. Steel had been struck. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The disbelief was too heavy, the shock too complete. The impossible had just happened in front of them. Rodriguez's jaw dropped. Miller blinked rapidly, as though trying to convince himself he hadn't imagined it. Even Captain Harris, a man not easily surprised, stood frozen, his mouth parted just slightly, his eyes narrowing in astonishment. Emily didn't smile. She didn't glance back at them for approval. She simply inhaled slowly, steadying herself again, and reloaded the rifle with smooth, practiced precision. To her, this wasn't a miracle. It was the result of patience and preparation. "Holy," Rodriguez whispered, cutting himself off. "She hit it," Miller said, his voice barely audible, filled with awe. "She actually hit it." "No way," another muttered, shaking his head as though denial could undo what they'd heard. That was luck. But Harris knew better. He'd seen her. The stillness, the control, the patience. That wasn't luck, it was mastery. "Do it again," he commanded, his voice lower now, but sharper. Emily adjusted the scope slightly, recalculating, her expression unchanged. The desert's heat shimmered as though mocking her attempt, but she ignored it. She pressed her cheek back to the stock, her breathing slowing into rhythm once more. The men behind her couldn't take their eyes off her now. Doubt had begun to unravel into reluctant fascination. The rifle cracked again. A second bullet tore into the air, riding the same invisible arc. The soldiers held their breath, eyes locked on the distant steel. Clang, another direct hit. Gasps rippled through the group. No one laughed now. No one whispered insults. The desert itself seemed to echo with disbelief. "She did it again," Miller breathed. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with awe. Rodriguez shook his head slowly, his cocky grin long gone. "That's impossible." Emily didn't flinch. She reloaded once more, methodical, calm. To her, each shot was its own world, its own calculation. She didn't rely on the success of the last or fear the failure of the next. Each one was a fresh question, and she intended to answer them all. The third shot thundered, rolling across the range. Clang, another perfect strike. The soldiers erupted, not with cheers, but with stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that followed revelation, the realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something they would never forget. Even Harris's stern mask cracked. His lips pressed into something close to a smile, though he quickly hid it behind his hand. His eyes, however, betrayed him, narrowed not with doubt, but with admiration. Emily reloaded again. By now, the men had stopped doubting. They leaned forward eagerly, eyes wide, their skepticism transformed into anticipation. They wanted to hear it now, the sharp, satisfying clang that had become music in the desert. The fourth shot rang out. Clang! This time, the sound felt louder, sharper, final. 4 shots. 4,000 meters. 4 undeniable truths. The men exhaled all at once, as though they had been holding their breath for minutes. A murmur spread through them, disbelief giving way to something else, respect. Rodriguez rubbed the back of his neck, shaking his head. I don't even know what to say. Miller's eyes shone, his earlier smugness replaced with genuine awe. She's the best shot I've ever seen. Harris finally stepped forward, breaking the spell. His boots crunched against the sand as he approached her prone figure. Emily remained still, lowering the rifle gently to the ground, her breathing calm, her expression unchanging. "Private Taylor," Harris said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, almost serene. "You've just done what 12 men before you could not. 4 shots. 4,000 meters. Do you understand the weight of that?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She simply met his gaze, her silence carrying more power than words. Finally, she spoke softly. "It was possible, sir." And in that simple reply, Harris heard everything: discipline, conviction, and an unshakable truth. The men behind them remained quiet, their earlier doubts shattered. None of them would ever forget this moment. In the heart of the desert, where silence had once mocked them, it was now broken not by failure, not by excuses, but by the sound of steel surrendering to a quiet girl's precision. The echoes of the fourth clang still hum in the desert air, reverberating across the firing range, like the toll of a bell that no one wanted to end. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world had paused. The heat shimmered on the horizon. The sun beat mercilessly overhead, but every soldier present felt a chill crawl up his spine. Emily Taylor lay motionless, lowering her rifle with the same calmness she had shown from the beginning. To her, the shots were done, the task completed. But to the men around her, the world had just shifted. Something impossible had been proven possible, and not by them. The silence cracked first with Miller's voice. 4 hits, he said softly, almost reverently. His words trembled, not from fear, but from awe. She didn't miss once. Rodriguez, usually the loudest in the group, stood with his arms limp at his sides. His trademark grin was gone. He blinked, muttering under his breath, as though trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. Nobody does that. Not 4,000 meters. Not 4 times. Unless, Miller countered, eyes still locked on Emily. They know exactly what they're doing. The other men shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado dissolved. Jokes and laughter had filled the air before she fired, but now shame lingered in their throats. They had mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her as unworthy. And she had responded without a single word, only precision. Captain Harris finally stepped forward, his boots crunching against the hot sand. He stopped near Rodriguez and cast him a long, hard look. "You had 12 tries, the captain said evenly. "And you laughed." His eyes narrowed. "She had 4 tries. And she succeeded." Rodriguez swallowed hard, unable to meet Harris's gaze. The captain's attention shifted to Emily. She was sitting up now, brushing sand from her sleeve, her rifle lying neatly beside her, as though it were nothing special, just another tool. Her face remained calm, unreadable. "Private Taylor," Harris said, his voice carrying authority, but also something else, a note of respect that had not been there before. "Do you realize what you've done here today?" Emily looked up, her eyes clear, steady. "I hit the target, sir." A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the group, though it was half-hearted. To Emily, it was a simple statement of fact. To them, it was a reminder of just how little fuss she made about her own greatness. Harris's lips twitched into something close to a smile. "That's one way to put it." He turned back to the men, his voice rising sharply. "Let this be a lesson. Precision doesn't come from noise, from swagger, or from excuses. It comes from discipline, from patience, from skill. She has all three. And until you learn to respect that, you'll keep missing." The words landed like hammer blows, scattering whatever fragments of pride the men had left. Rodriguez, red-faced, finally muttered, "She makes it look too easy." Emily, quiet as ever, spoke before anyone else could. It wasn't easy. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was matter-of-fact, stripped of arrogance. "It's never easy. But I don't stop until it feels right." Her words sank deep into the silence. Unlike their excuses, hers carried weight. Miller looked at her with something close to admiration. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Emily paused, considering. "My father taught me," she said simply. "He always told me a rifle is honest. If you miss, it's not the gun. It's you." The men glanced at one another, as though realizing just how far behind they were, not in equipment, but in mindset. Harris nodded. Honest advice. He studied her closely, his sharp eyes narrowing again, but this time not with suspicion. "Private Taylor, I've seen trained marksmen fold under less pressure than this. You stayed calm, silent, focused. That's not just skill. That's composure." Emily shifted her gaze downward, brushing a stray grain of sand from the stock of her rifle. "Thank you, sir." Behind her, the group of men shuffled awkwardly. The mocking they had thrown at her before now tasted sour in their mouths. The quiet girl they had dismissed had just accomplished something none of them could. And worse, she had done it without seeking to prove herself to them. That silence humbling, heavy spread through the line. No one dared laugh now. No one dared challenge her. For the first time since arriving at the range, Emily felt their eyes on her, not with disdain, but with respect. Some looked guilty, others curious, but all of them understood one thing. She had earned her place. Rodriguez finally broke, his pride crumbling under the weight of truth. "All right," he muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "I'll admit it, that was impressive." Miller smirked slightly. "Impressive? That was history, man." The other soldiers nodded in agreement. What had begun as skepticism was now reverence. Captain Harris let the moment linger before speaking again. "Gentlemen, take a good look. Today, you've been reminded of something vital. Skill doesn't wear a face. It doesn't come with volume, or arrogance, or swagger. It comes in silence, in patience, in stillness." He gestured toward Emily. "And today, she's the example." Emily shifted uncomfortably under the attention. She didn't crave their applause. She hadn't taken those shots to earn their validation. She had done it because the challenge demanded precision, and she knew she could answer it. Still, she couldn't help but feel the weight of their stares soften, changing from mockery to something else, acknowledgement. Rodriguez approached hesitantly, clearing his throat. "Hey, Taylor." Emily looked up at him. "You, good shooting." His voice cracked, and the words sounded foreign on his tongue, as though he'd never complimented anyone in his life. Emily only nodded. "Thank you." The simplicity of her reply made Rodriguez feel even smaller. But in that moment, he also felt something else, respect he hadn't known he was capable of. As the men began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, Harris leaned closer to Emily, his voice lowered, meant for her alone. "Private, you've just silenced a lot more than targets today." Emily tilted her head, curious. "You've silenced doubt," Harris said. "And that's harder than any shot you'll ever take." Her gaze drifted back to the horizon where the steel plate still stood, scarred by 4 perfect hits. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She only whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, "Targets don't lie." And with that, Emily Taylor, the quiet soldier once overlooked, had redrawn the unspoken hierarchy of the range, not with words, but with the echo of steel ringing in the desert air. The desert sun was sliding westward now, its golden light stretching shadows across the range. The heat had not relented, but the atmosphere among the soldiers had shifted entirely. Where only hours ago there had been smirks, dismissive laughter, and whispers about the quiet girl, there was now an air of awe, as if they had witnessed a miracle. Emily Taylor stood apart from it all, kneeling in the sand beside her rifle. She cleaned it carefully, brushing grains from the stock, wiping the scope with methodical precision. She treated the weapon the same way she had treated the shot, with respect. The men hovered nearby, uncertain. They spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at her, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. "She hit it 4 times, Miller muttered, still shaking his head. "I swear I'll be hearing that clang in my dreams." Rodriguez, humbled but still stubborn, crossed his arms. "Yeah, well, she made us all look like rookies." Miller gave him a side glance. "That's because compared to her, we are rookies." The words stung, but no one challenged them. For the first time, Rodriguez stayed quiet. Captain Harris, who had watched it all unfold, studied his unit carefully. He had seen arrogance dissolve, seen pride humbled. And now he watched something else grow respect. It was quiet, tentative, but unmistakable. He called them together. "Form up." The men obeyed, forming a line with Emily among them. For once, no one pushed ahead of her. No one tried to stand taller or mutter a joke at her expense. She took her place silently, rifle slung across her back. Harris paced in front of them, his boots crunching against the desert floor. "What you saw today should teach you something. Skill does not shout. It does not boast. It proves itself in silence." Private Taylor proved that. The men nodded slowly, some shifting with discomfort, others with reluctant acknowledgement. She did not need 12 tries. She did not need excuses. She did not need noise. She had patience, precision, and control. That's what wins battles. That's what keeps you alive. Harris's voice grew sharper. And if you want to survive out there, you better learn from her. Emily felt their eyes on her. She lowered her gaze, uncomfortable with the attention. She had not fired those shots for glory. She had not wanted to embarrass anyone. She had only wanted to do her job. But now, standing in the line of soldiers who had once mocked her, she realized she had gained something she never asked for: respect. After dismissal, the men gathered around her awkwardly, unsure of how to bridge the gap they had built with their earlier derision. Miller was the first to step forward. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking to her rifle. You shoot like a machine. Never seen anything like it." Emily looked up at him briefly, then back at her rifle. "It's just practice." Miller shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It's control. I've been shooting for years, but I've never been that calm behind a scope." Rodriguez, standing nearby, finally sighed. His pride fought him, but the weight of reality was heavier. "All right, Taylor. I'll admit it. I was wrong. You're better than I thought." Emily didn't gloat, didn't smile triumphantly. She only said softly, I don't need to be better than you. I just need to do my job." Her words struck harder than any boast could have. Miller chuckled quietly. "See? That's the thing. You don't care about beating us. That's why you're ahead of us." The group fell silent again, each man reflecting on the truth of that statement. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert, Harris approached Emily privately. His stern demeanor softened, though his voice remained measured. "Private Taylor," he said, "you understand what you accomplished today isn't just about a target." Emily looked at him curiously. "You proved something more important," Harris continued. "You showed this unit that strength doesn't always come from the loudest voice or the heaviest hand. Sometimes it comes from stillness, from discipline. And you've earned their respect, not by demanding it, but by showing it." Emily nodded, her expression calm. "Respect isn't taken, sir. It's given." Harris's lips pressed into a rare smile. "And you've earned it the right way." When the men regrouped at the mess hall that evening, the atmosphere was different. For the first time, Emily wasn't sitting alone at the far end of the table. Miller slid onto the bench across from her. Rodriguez, after a moment's hesitation, joined as well. Soon the others followed. They didn't shower her with questions or praise. They didn't make a spectacle. Instead, they included her in the simple rhythm of soldier life passing bread, trading stories, laughing cautiously. The old tension was gone. Rodriguez raised his cup halfway. "To Taylor," he muttered, not looking her in the eye. "The quiet sniper." The men chuckled, but it wasn't cruel this time. It was affectionate, a new nickname born not of mockery, but of respect. Emily only shook her head slightly, a faint trace of amusement in her otherwise calm expression. She didn't want titles or nicknames, but she didn't correct them either. As the night wore on, the men relaxed, the earlier humility settling into camaraderie. Miller leaned closer to her at one point and whispered, "You know, they'll be telling stories about you for a long time." Emily glanced at him, her voice soft but steady. "Stories fade. Results stay?" Miller laughed. "Maybe, but sometimes stories inspire results." She didn't argue. She simply looked down at her food, her thoughts already drifting back to the horizon, to the steel plate scarred by her 4 shots. Later, as the stars emerged over the desert, Emily sat outside the barracks, rifle across her lap. The laughter of her unit echoed faintly behind her, no longer sharp with mockery, but warm with newfound respect. She gazed into the distance, where the target still stood under the fading light. For her, it wasn't about the recognition she had earned that day. It wasn't about silencing doubters or impressing officers. It was about the discipline it took to steady her hands, to still her breathing, to wait for the perfect moment. Respect was a byproduct. Precision was the goal. And as she sat in the quiet night, Emily Taylor understood something deeper. She had not only earned her unit's respect, she had also reminded herself of who she truly was. Not the quiet girl in the shadows. Not the overlooked soldier. She was the sniper who could make the desert sing with steel. Weeks passed after that scorching day on the desert range, but the echoes of Emily Taylor's feet refused to fade. The sound of the steel plates struck by 4 perfect bullets remained alive in the minds of every soldier who had witnessed it. Even those who had mocked her initially carried the memory with a mix of awe and shame. In the barracks, the atmosphere had transformed. The once rowdy, competitive banter now included a new undercurrent of respect, especially toward Taylor. No longer the overlooked quiet girl in the corner, she became the silent center of attention, though she never sought it. She did not boast or demand acknowledgement. She simply carried herself with the same calm, measured discipline she had displayed on the range. Captain Harris observed the change with a quiet satisfaction. His unit had been fractured by ego and impatience, but her demonstration had not only proven skill, but also reshaped their approach to discipline and teamwork. The lesson went beyond marksmanship. It was about focus, patience, humility, and respect earned rather than demanded. Word of Emily's feat spread beyond the immediate unit. In military circles, the story traveled quickly, first whispered between soldiers, then recorded in logs, and eventually cited as an example of extraordinary marksmanship under extreme conditions. Her 4,000-meter shot, executed with silent precision, became a benchmark in sniper training discussions. Other units began to refer to her informally as the Quiet Sniper. At first, the nickname carried an element of amusement, but as the story spread, it became a symbol of discipline and skill. New recruits were told her tale during orientation, not just to inspire them, but to remind them that excellence often came quietly, not from volume or showmanship. Emily herself remained unaffected by the growing reputation. She did not seek glory, nor did she want it. To her, the essence of the feat had always been the challenge itself, the discipline of breathing slowly, the calculations of wind and drop, the mastery of patience. Recognition was incidental, a byproduct of skill exercised under pressure. But the effect on her unit was profound. Soldiers who had once belittled her now actively sought her guidance, asking questions about technique, wind reading, and the subtle adjustments that made the difference between failure and perfection. Miller, once a skeptic, now watched her with a keen interest, eager to learn. Rodriguez, though still rugged and brash at times, approached her with newfound humility. Emily's calm approach had become a subtle teacher. She didn't correct with harsh words. She simply demonstrated, allowing others to witness the process, absorbing lessons from her silent example. Her presence reminded them that excellence did not require boasting. It required patience, focus, and respect for the craft. Captain Harris often observed these interactions quietly. He realized that Emily's influence extended far beyond the desert range. She was shaping the culture of the unit, transforming arrogance into humility and skepticism into curiosity. By example, she had turned doubters into students. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Harris found Emily seated alone, cleaning her rifle beneath the last slivers of daylight. The desert wind whispered around her, carrying the coolness of approaching night. "Private Taylor," he said, approaching softly, careful not to startle her. She looked up and nodded, a polite acknowledgement without ceremony. "You've done more than I expected," Harris continued. "Your shot, your discipline, it's changed more than just this range. You've changed this unit. You've reminded everyone here what it means to earn respect quietly." Emily considered him silently. Finally, she said, "I didn't do it to change anyone, sir. I just did what had to be done." Harris smiled faintly. And yet, change is what followed. The desert stretched endlessly behind them, a reminder of both challenge and possibility. Emily felt the familiar calm settle over her, the quiet strength that had carried her through that impossible shot. She didn't need validation. Her confidence was built on preparation, focus, and precision. But she understood something now, something she hadn't before. By demonstrating mastery without seeking applause, she had inspired others. She had shown that greatness often speaks quietly, yet resonates louder than the loudest voice in the room. Over time, Emily's reputation became part of the unit's culture. New recruits arrived knowing the story of the Quiet Sniper, a tale that encouraged discipline, focus, and humility. Older soldiers looked to her example whenever frustration or ego threatened to cloud judgment. And though she never claimed the title, the Quiet Sniper followed her like a shadow, a symbol of precision and poise. She continued to train, to mentor, and to push herself, never content with past successes. Each shot, each calculation, each day in the desert reminded her that mastery was a journey, not a destination. The steel targets, scarred by her bullets, were no longer just exercises. They were lessons, reminders of patience, focus, and the quiet power of skill. Years later, the story of that day still circulated among soldiers, instructors, and marksmen. They recounted the account of a quiet girl who stepped forward when all others had failed, who took 4 impossible shots at 4,000 meters, and who did so without arrogance, without seeking approval, and without hesitation. Emily herself would smile quietly at these stories, knowing the truth. It was never about proving herself to anyone. It had always been about proving what could be done with calm, measured determination, discipline, and respect for the craft. And in that way, the legacy of the quiet sniper endured not in fame or glory, but in the lessons quietly imparted, the respect earned without demand, and the enduring proof that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest strength. The desert, silent yet infinite, had witnessed her feat. The steel plates, scarred and bent from her bullets, remained as monuments to precision and control. And Emily Taylor, once overlooked, once doubted, now stood as a symbol of quiet mastery, a reminder that true power is often silent, patient, and unassuming, yet capable of reshaping the world around it. Her story would echo for years to come, whispered in barracks, recounted in training sessions, remembered not for noise or spectacle, but for the undeniable proof that skill, patience, and quiet determination could achieve the impossible. And somewhere in the desert, beneath the endless sky, the legacy of the quiet sniper remained, immortalized not by fame, but by the reverberation of 4 perfect hits across 4,000 meters, and the silent lessons they carried into every heart that witnessed them.